In this video, we are talking about 10 players that you must start in week 15 of fantasy football. But before we get into it, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you do end up enjoying. Starting at number 10, Brian Robinson Jr., who put together a strong performance in week 13 against a tough Titans run defense. 16 carries, 103 yards, touchdown, and 17.9 fantasy points. Now coming off a bye, B-Rob should be well rested, hopefully fully healthy at this point for the fantasy playoffs. And over his last two games, he is averaging 17 touches and 90 total yards. And at this point is the workhorse back on a good Commanders offense. We know Austin Eckler is now done for the fantasy season on IR. The matchup and the game script is also very favorable for the Commanders going up against the Saints, who, as we know, will not have Derek Carr. So they should have full command of this game. And you can run all over the Saints, who have allowed an NFL high 5.4 yards per carry since week 6, along with the 8th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. So we know these last couple of weeks, Robinson hasn't really been right, hasn't been himself because he's been injured. But now coming off a bye, fully healthy, I think we really start to see what he's capable of. That's not to say he hasn't had good games. We know he has, but I think this bye came at a perfect time, and I think he's going to carry you down the stretch when you need him the most. At number 9, Khalil Shakir is starting to heat up as he scored at least 15 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. And since week 7, he's the wide receiver 24 in fantasy points per game, along with earning a 24% target share, 30% first read share, 8.3 targets per game. That's really nice to see, along with 6 red zone targets over his last 7 games. And Shakir at this point has really turned into Allen's safety blanket and go-to receiver. Yes, Keon Coleman is expected to be back, potentially Dalton Kincaid as well. But I think at this point, Shakir has been well integrated into this offense, and he's a big piece going forward, whether those guys are healthy or not. And Khalil should be able to build off his impressive performance in week 14, where he racked up 21.6 fantasy points. It appears Buffalo is set for another shootout this week against the red-hot Detroit Lions. We know what happened last week against the Rams. A lot of points were scored, and I think we have a similar outcome in this game, as the Lions have allowed the most fantasy points to slot receivers. So get Shakir in your lineup and expect good things. At number 8, Rico Dowdle, who made the start list for us last week, and he came through with 15 fantasy points. We like to see that. We're going straight back to the well this week, as Rico has completely taken over this Dallas backfield, seeing 66 of the 76 running back touches over the last 3 games. That is insane, and has played at least 64% of the snaps, along with racking up 362 total yards, and is the RB11 in fantasy points per game over the last 3 games. Really nice to see. I think there's no denying at this point how good the 4th-year running back has been over the last couple of weeks, as he ranks first in yards after contact per attempt, first in carries of 10+ yards, first in rushing yards, and 4th in missed tackles forced per attempt. Rico honestly might have been a league winner if he was seeing this type of usage from the beginning, from week 1. I don't know why Ezekiel Elliott had to be a thing early on. Super frustrating, but nonetheless, Dowdle is looking like someone who's going to carry you to potentially a fantasy title, as he's likely going to shred this terrible Carolina Panthers run defense, who's allowing the most fantasy points to running backs this season. So ride the hot hand of Dowdle. The matchup's beautiful. Get him in your lineup, and I think he has a huge performance in week 15. At number 7, Adam Thielen, the 34-year-old receiver, is here to remind us all that he has still got it. He's not finished yet, as he's been sensational over the last 2 games. Week 13, 8 receptions, 99 yards, a touchdown, 23.9 fantasy points. And then last week, 9 receptions, 102 yards, 19.2 fantasy points, along with earning a 26% target share, 31% first read share, 2.72 yards per route run. Bryce Young finally is starting to figure it out. He's playing really good football. He looks pretty impressive out there compared to the player that we saw the beginning of this year. Obviously, last year wasn't great, but he's really turned it around, and Thielen has been the main beneficiary of that. And the duo between Young and Thielen has been very impressive. They look to be on the same page, as 84% of their targets have been charted as catchable since week 13. There's really no one else in this Carolina passing attack. Yes, you have Xavier Legette, who continues to drop easy passes, hasn't really shown us much. Adam at this point is the go-to guy for Carolina when they need to throw the ball. They are looking for Thielen, and he should have another big game against the Cowboys, who have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to slot receivers this season. At number 6, Rachaad White. Who would have thought we would be back on the White train at this point? It's been really unfortunate because I do have Bucky Irving in a lot of my leagues. We really need him, obviously, in the fantasy playoffs. Looks like he might play, but it could be the similar story as last week where he plays a little bit, doesn't do much, then re-injures his back. So Bucky's hard to trust. I understand if you have to put him in this week, but I think Rachaad White is going to benefit, obviously, with no Irving. And I'm expecting another big game from him. And White really impressed in week 14, over 100 total yards, 2 touchdowns, 24.9 fantasy points. He was the RB4 on the week. And Rachaad saw 80% of the snaps and 11 of the 14 running back carries once Irving left due to injury last week. We know White isn't the most explosive or efficient back out there. And I think he's a strong start, mainly because of his projected volume on a good offense, especially if there is no Bucky. He would be a top 10 play at the position, not to take anything away from Rachaad because he has been better as of late. RB10 since week 7, averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. And the matchup is very beatable against the Chargers, who haven't been as good as of late against the run, as they've allowed the 12th most rushing yards per game since week 9. So it might be a little scary because we know Rachaad is a guy that can get hot and cold at times, but I think you can be pretty confident about having him in your lineup in week 15. At number 5, Garrett Wilson, who, let's face it, at this point has been one of the bright spots on this horrid New York Jets offense and put together one of his best games of the year in week 14. 7 receptions, 114 receiving yards, which was a season high, and 18.4 fantasy points. This game was very needed after a pretty rough 3-game slump for Wilson, and a lot of this has to do to Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers playing better, looks healthier than he's been in the past. They had a bye a couple weeks ago, so that has helped, and Rodgers threw for his first 300-yard passing game since 2021. That's kind of crazy. Granted, he didn't play all of last year, but still, if Rodgers can continue to play better like we know he can, he is older. He's obviously not the same player, but if he can just be an average quarterback, Wilson should eat the remainder of the season. Since week 7, he's the wide receiver 22 in fantasy points per game. He's earned 7 red zone targets, 25% target share, 32% first read share. I think Wilson should continue to be the focal point of this offense, especially with a lot of question marks around Breece Hall, around this running game. So I'm excited about Wilson for the rest of the season. And the matchup is very juicy against the Jaguars, who have allowed the 4th most yards and fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. So I think Garrett stays hot and balls out in week 15. At number 4, Aaron Jones has been very up and down for most of the season, but I think you can trust him in the playoffs in round 1, as he scored 16 plus fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games and continues to see workhorse volume on a really good Minnesota offense that is just on a heater at this point, especially after last week. And Jones is averaging 18 touches and 91 total yards per game, along with 15 plus opportunities in 7 out of his last 8 games, while ranking 6th in red zone touches, 15th in opportunity share, and he's getting it done on the ground as well, as he's averaging 4.5 yards per carry since week 7. And Jones just went off against the Chicago Bears defense in week 12 as he racked up 20 fantasy points. I think we see much of the same from him this week, as the Bears have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, along with allowing the most rushing yards since week 10. I really like Jones to go off in week 15. At number 3, Brian Thomas Jr. has been insanely impressive. The fact that he's getting it done with Mac Jones under center tells you all you need to know about how special of a player he is. BTJ has earned double-digit targets in back-to-back games, along with the 25% target share since Mac Jones took over as QB1, and ranks inside the top 20 in yards per route run, and only 5 other rookies have a higher yards per route run since 2014. I think it's fair to say at this point that Brian is matchup proof due to his consistent volume and insane ability, talent. Even with Mac Jones under center, he continues to impress. And now with Evan Ingram done for the year, Thomas is going to drown in targets going forward. The matchup this week against the Jets looks bad on paper, but it's much better than you think, especially with DJ Reed listed as doubtful, who arguably has been the Jets' best corner this year. And the Jets rank dead last in EPA per dropback and have allowed the 10th most receiving yards per game since week 9. Plus, Sauce Gardner and company seem really checked out at this point after a massively disappointing season. At number 2, David Montgomery continues to eat and is one of the most consistent running backs in all of fantasy football. It sure does help though to, be running behind a top 2 offensive line on one of the best offenses in football with a brilliant play caller in Ben Johnson. And Montgomery continues to take advantage of his perfect situation in Detroit as he scored 15 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games and is a touchdown machine as he's racked up 12 trips to the end zone already this year. I want as many pieces of this game as possible. It's going to be high scoring. It's going to be a shootout against Buffalo. This game has a 54.5 projected point total, which is the highest on the slate. And I'm expecting Montgomery to continue his hot streak against the Bills, who have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to the running back position this season. At number 1, Jerry Jeudy has blossomed into a very strong fantasy asset now that he is a capable quarterback under center in Jameis Winston and is the wide receiver 2 in fantasy somehow since week 7. Absolutely wild. We all know about that monster performance that he had in week 13 where he racked up 40 fantasy points. And while he didn't duplicate that the following week, he still had a very nice day in week 14. 5 receptions, 64 yards, touchdown, and 17.4 fantasy points. And Jeudy has been absolutely incredible since Winston took over, averaging 9 targets, 6 receptions, 103 receiving yards, and 21 fantasy points, showing us at this point that he has a very safe floor with a matchup winning ceiling. And I'd expect Jeudy to keep it rolling in a game without Cedric Tillman yet again, and a very questionable David Njoku. Yes, he says he's going to play, but if he plays, how effective is he really going to be? Jeudy should be the Browns' entire passing attack against the Chiefs, who have struggled as of late, allowing the 2nd most receiving yards since week 10. And even though Kansas City is not the same offense that they once were, they're winning really close games. I would still not be surprised if Cleveland is chasing points in this one. Jeudy is a must start across the board, and I think he's set up for another monster performance in week 15. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you could please like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out more than you know, and I will see you in the next one.